Imagine boarding a flight, expecting nothing more than a routine journey, only to witness an encounter that shakes you to your core. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, an elderly woman shuffles down the aisle, her hands trembling as she clutches her boarding pass. She smiles warmly at the passengers she passes, her kind eyes searching for her assigned seat. But when she reaches her row, her smile fades. Standing in front of her is a flight attendant who seems more focused on efficiency than compassion. What happens next is as shocking as it is heartbreaking. A simple request from the elderly woman turns into a moment that captures the attention of everyone nearby. Whispers ripple through the cabin, passengers exchanging concerned glances. Some are too stunned to intervene, while others are quietly recording the unfolding drama. But just as the tension reaches its peak, something unexpected happens, something that changes everything. You won't believe the ripple effect of one moment of disregard and how it leads to a confrontation no one saw coming. Stay tuned, because this story will leave you questioning how much a small act of kindness, or the lack of it, can impact the lives of others. As the elderly woman tried to explain her predicament, her voice, though soft, carried a trembling urgency. "I'm sorry, dear," she said, holding up her ticket, "but I think this is my seat." Her smile was tentative, her expression almost apologetic. The flight attendant, tall and impeccably dressed in the airline's uniform, barely glanced at the ticket before sighing audibly. "You need to step aside, Mom. We're trying to board other passengers," the attendant replied, her tone sharp and dismissive. A young couple in the nearby seats exchanged uneasy glances. A man seated a row ahead peeked over his shoulder, sensing that something wasn't right. The elderly woman hesitated, gripping the edge of the seat for support. She looked around as if seeking someone who might step in, but the passengers remained frozen in their places, unsure of how to react. I just need help with my bag," she murmured, pointing to the small suitcase at her feet. "My arms aren't what they used to be." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to handle your luggage. You should have checked it in if you couldn't manage it yourself." Her voice was louder now, drawing the attention of more passengers. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. A man in a business suit leaned toward his colleague. "She didn't have to talk to her like that," he muttered. Nearby, a mother traveling with her child adjusted her seatbelt and shot a disapproving look at the attendant. Yet, no one spoke up. The elderly woman's face fell, and she began to bend down to lift the suitcase herself. Her frail hands trembled as she tried to lift the bag. It was clear she wasn't strong enough. At that moment, a young boy seated nearby stood up. He couldn't have been older than 10. "I can help you, Mom," he offered, his voice small but steady. The flight attendant spun around, her expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "Sit down, young man. We don't need any more disruptions." The boy's mother quickly pulled him back into his seat, whispering something to him, her face flushed with embarrassment. The elderly woman managed a weak smile toward the boy before shaking her head. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. As the tension in the cabin thickened, a middle-aged man sitting in an aisle seat finally stood up. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly. His voice was calm, but commanding. "I'll help her." He reached for the woman's suitcase and easily placed it in the overhead compartment. The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. The flight attendant, however, was not pleased. "Sir, you're not authorized to—" "Oh, give it a rest," he interrupted, his tone sharp. She needed help, and It's not that hard to show a little humanity. A few passengers murmured their agreement. The flight attendant's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing, spinning on her heel and walking briskly toward the front of the plane. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence as the elderly woman took her seat, thanking the man profusely. But the tension lingered in the air, and it was clear that the incident had left a mark. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others scrolling through their phones, likely sharing their version of the story on social media. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the elderly woman sat quietly, gazing out the window. But something about her demeanor hinted at a deeper sadness. What had brought her onto this flight? Was she traveling to visit family? Or was she leaving something behind? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the flight attendant was having a heated conversation with another crew member. Their voices were low, but the tension was palpable. "I don't care what they think," she snapped. "Rules are rules." But her colleague seemed less convinced. "You didn't have to be so harsh," he replied. "She's just an old woman. It wouldn't have hurt to help her out." As the plane took off and the flight progressed, small acts of kindness began to ripple through the cabin. A young woman offered to swap seats with her father so he could sit next to his daughter. Another passenger shared snacks with a teenager who had forgotten to pack any. It was as if the initial tension had sparked a quiet rebellion, a reminder of the importance of compassion. Yet, the elderly woman remained mostly silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She occasionally glanced at the flight attendant as she moved through the aisle, her expression unreadable. It was clear, however, that the incident was far from forgotten. And as the flight neared its destination, an unexpected announcement over the intercom would change everything. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received some news that will require your attention. We ask for your cooperation and patience as we handle this matter." The passengers looked around, puzzled. The elderly woman sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. Whatever was coming next, it was bound to unravel them. Tension that had been brewing since the flight began. And no one, least of all, the flight attendant, was prepared for what would unfold. The cabin buzzed with confusion as the captain's voice faded. Passengers exchanged worried glances, trying to make sense of the cryptic announcement. The flight attendant stiffened, her brisk movements suddenly halting as she glanced toward the cockpit. Whatever was happening, it was clear that she hadn't been expecting it either. The elderly woman leaned toward the window, her hands tightening around them armrests. Her quiet demeanor had shifted, a hint of apprehension crossing her face. The man who had helped her with her luggage leaned across the aisle. Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, but her smile was faint and didn't quite reach her eyes. Moments later, the captain's voice returned, sounding slightly more composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of an urgent situation involving one of our passengers. Please remain seated while the crew addresses the matter." All eyes seemed to turn toward the elderly woman, who visibly tensed. The flight attendant hurried toward her, her expression a strange mix of annoyance and uncertainty. "Mom, I need to ask you a few questions," she said, her tone lacking the earlier sharpness but still far from warm. The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering between the attendant and the concerned passengers around her. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before the attendant could respond, a passenger in the back stood up abruptly, holding his phone. "I think I know what this is about," he said loudly. I just saw a post online this flight's being tracked because of her. He pointed toward the elderly woman, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The woman shrank into her seat, her face pale. I don't understand, she murmured. The man who had helped her earlier stood up again, his posture protective. Hey, that's enough, he said firmly, directing his words at the man with the phone. You don't even know what's going on. Sit down and let the crew handle it. But the damage was done. Passengers were murmuring, speculating, their curiosity and fear mingling. The elderly woman's hands trembled in her lap as she struggled to find her voice. Finally, she looked up at the flight attendant. I don't know what they're talking about, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. The flight attendant hesitated, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. She looked toward her colleague, who had approached to assist. The authorities will be waiting when we land, she said quietly. For now, let's just keep things calm. The elderly woman's shoulders sagged as she let out a shaky breath. I'm just going to see my daughter, she whispered. She's in the hospital. I don't know why this is happening. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, slowly, the man who had helped her sat down again. We believe you, he said, his voice steady. Across the aisle, the young boy who had earlier offered to help leaned toward his mother. Why are they being mean to her? He asked in a stage whisper. His mother shushed him gently, but looked troubled herself. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. The passengers' earlier judgment had softened, replaced by unease and guilt. Some offered the elderly woman sympathetic glances, while others avoided eye contact altogether. When the plane landed, the promised authorities were indeed waiting. 2. Uniformed officers boarded, their expressions professional but not unkind. They approached the elderly woman, who sat trembling in her seat. Mom, one of them said softly. Can you come with us, please? The man who had helped her stood again. Hold on, he said, his tone firm. This woman hasn't done anything wrong. She's just trying to visit her daughter. The officer nodded, his expression understanding. We're not accusing anyone of anything, he explained. There was an anonymous report about a missing person. We need to confirm her identity, that's all. The elderly woman's face crumpled with relief and exhaustion. She nodded, gathering her belongings with shaky hands. As she stood, the man offered her his arm, and she accepted it gratefully. Passengers watched silently as the woman was escorted off the plane. Whispers filled the cabin again, but now they carried a tone of regret. As the flight attendant stood at the front of the plane, her earlier confidence seemed completely eroded. The man who had helped the elderly woman paused as he passed her. You know, he said quietly, a little kindness goes a long way. Maybe think about that next time. Outside the terminal, the situation was quickly resolved. The officers confirmed that the elderly woman was, in fact, the person she claimed to be. The anonymous report had been a misunderstanding, likely fueled by a stranger's overactive imagination. The woman turned to the man who had helped her, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not just for helping me, but for believing me. He smiled gently. It was the right thing to do. As she was reunited with her daughter in the hospital later that day, the woman reflected on the events of the flight. It had been a difficult journey, but amidst the tension and judgment, there had also been kindness. The story of the flight spread quickly, with passengers sharing their experiences online. Many focused on the importance of compassion, calling out the flight attendant's behavior while praising the man's actions. The incident sparked a broader conversation about the treatment of vulnerable individuals, reminding people that small acts of kindness can make a world of difference. And for the elderly woman, the lesson was simple but profound. Even in moments of struggle, there are always those who will stand up for what's right.